Hey, could you hit the lights for a second?
You got it.
Well, Randy, it sounds like he would never get elected. I mean, he wouldn't be allowed to, but if he did, what does he want to do? What's his platform?
Undo,
Pardon?
undo everything that, I mean, I don't know, obviously he wants to do what the Ukrainians are trying to do, which is disconnect from the Russian system in every possible way. And he's so integrated into Europe, again, like Ukraine, he's trying to appeal to the Europeans and Americans, but mainly the Europeans, to support him. But I mean, all he talks about is democracy and all the things you would expect him to talk about, I guess. But it's one thing for the Ukrainians to try to do these things, which is what we're going to go through tonight. But even Ukraine, when they became independent after the Soviet Union fell apart, now they're suddenly their own sovereign country. They still carried around a legacy from the Soviets that to this day is they can't shed. I mean, this, and again, we're going to get into this too tonight, but the biggest problem the Ukrainians have is corruption. And as soon as they became an independent country, the old Soviet guys took over the politics of the Ukraine. And these are like ticks embedded under your skin. You can't get rid of these guys. And they ran politics and all kinds of, the way they governed in Soviet Union, the minute Ukraine became a separate country, the same basic guys were in place and stayed in place. And they've been trying to get, and the corruption that they brought, that's how they do things, right? There's no civil society, there's none of that. And it just, the lesson is, you know, you can get free from your oppressor, from your empire, from your, you know, you can be free of Russia, but you really can't. I mean, it takes generation to get free of it all. It just sticks to you. It's embedded everywhere. And
that's what the president of Ukraine now is trying to do. He's not part of that group, right?
No, and they've had several elections and presidents. And one of them was, oh, Dan, this is tonight too, is Putin. It was Putin's. What's that?
Zelensky's predecessor was one of Putin's puppets.
No, well, no, actually,
Wasn't he?
no, well, there's been a lot of presidents over the last 20 years in Ukraine. There was a revolution in 2004 called the Orange Revolution.
Right.
And then there was another one in 2014, which is the Maidan Revolution, which changed everything, which produced Zelensky and all kinds of good things. But the 2004 one was Putin's guy,
Right.
An
That's what
oligarch
I'm referring to.
against a local guy who was a reformer, ran against corruption and all that. And it was almost a dead even tie, but they gave it to the Putin guy. And the problem is, of course, the minute he won that election in 2013, actually, students hit the street, created the Maidan Revolution, which exiled. Then he had to run back to Putin. He left the country on his own. And we'll go through this, but he was replaced by a true reformer kind of guy. Poroshenko, his name was, and he tried to begin reforms and get rid of some obvious corruption problems. But if he didn't do it fast enough, so they voted him out. Well, you know, it takes a long time to get rid of corruption, right? And Ukrainian people are so impatient with dealing with it and the oligarchs and all that crap, because they've got their own oligarchs, that they kicked him out and hired Zelensky, who ran on the same promise, corruption, integration with Europe. And that was in 2019. not that long ago, Zelensky was elected. And just before the Russian invasion, he was already, his approval rate, his approval was dropping like a rock in Ukraine, Zelensky, because he wasn't going fast enough with anti-corruption work. And then the Russian invasion happened, and you've seen how he reacted to that. He became this amazing hero kind of guy, fearless. And now he's got, you know, everybody loves him. But had the not, if the invasion hadn't happened, he'd probably been pushed out of the presidency by another guy who's promising to get rid of corruption. I mean, this is, the Ukrainians are so sick of corruption and trying to get rid of it. And they're so impatient. They're not giving any of their presidents the time to really make a dent in it. And Zelensky, like I say, he was elected with 71% of the vote the first time Zelensky was elected, 2019. But by 2022, you know, he was down into the 40s. And there's nothing wrong with the guy. The guy's got all the right instincts, but he's not going fast enough. So.
Well, probably later tonight in the presentation, you'll touch on the significance of the falling of the city here recently. I mean, that's.
The falling of what?
The city, when they, you know, the Russians finally, they saw in the news today.
Oh,
Yeah.
Mariupol.
Mariupol, yeah.
It seems to me, because I was researching that, Mariupol was an incredible example of what happened after Zelensky was elected. Azovstal and Mariupol were thriving. And it was like a personal thing with Vladimir Putin. He just couldn't stand it.
But according to the news today, it's falling.
Well, they finally abandoned,
So,
right.
I mean, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, although it,
Yeah, but they've retaken Kharkiv.
well, but in the Mariupol case, right,
Yeah.
that small contingents of soldiers
That's right.
held on for pushing 3 months
Months, yeah.
against, I mean, how did it, what else can you throw at that country or that city? There's totally nothing left of it. And it was one of the major
Certainly a moral
ports.
victory, but it's.
But the Russians, once they got the civilians out, which was grotesque, how they wouldn't let them leave for weeks and weeks. The military that remained just stayed there and kept resisting and resisting. And they finally, I think, were compelled to leave.
Yeah.
They didn't want to, they were compelled to leave. The
So
Russians
200
never
of them.
pushed them out. It's not like they lost.
Yeah.
They said, okay, we
They've
have,
done it
there's
some-
other places we can be used.
They've done it some
Another
Russian
day.
location, I guess, for medical attention.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Well,
yeah, exactly. How could they, it's amazing anybody lived through that, right? So,
I said it was like 280 of them or something. What a huge number.
yeah.
there were
no,
more than 280,
Yeah.
there were 280 or 290 that were injured.
Mhm.
And probably close to 1,000 troops, I think, because I was just on the internet looking through a variety of sites. So it was like 900 something. But what I read was that some of them were taken to a penal colony in Russia.
Well,
And
they've
the
been,
agreement was that they were supposed to have been taken to Turkey for some kind of prisoner swap. Not that you can trust Vladimir Putin's words for anything.
well, but they've taken, I mean, one of the stories that will be really something to finally hear it is how many civilians and military they've taken from Ukraine and put in camps in Russia.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, thousands of people, and nobody knows how many or who the hell they really are. I mean, they've just vanished, and now they're in the, what do they call them? Not reconstruction camps, but something camps. I don't know.
Yeah,
But you
it's
could
like,
just imagine what they're going through. I
it's
mean-
like this Stalin, Xi Jinping, Uyghur maneuver.
Yeah, well, that's how it sounds, isn't it? Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely sounds that way.
Orwell foresaw it.
So I was not going to read this, but I think with you guys, let me just read something. So we're going to talk about it's pretty brutal stuff we're going to go through this, right? I can't, get around it. Between the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalin and Hitler and the Holocaust started in Ukraine. I mean, I've never heard the Holocaust story the way you're going to hear it tonight, because it's just shocking to me about that. And the famines, the wars they've been through, I can't imagine a country that's been through more trauma than these folks. Just nobody comes close. And there's this notion of historical memory that even for those that recovered, they're alive now, but their parents, grandparents, great grandparents lived through all this ridiculous amount of pain and atrocities. It's just, it's shocking. You don't just get free one day and it ends and you're okay. Trauma is, it's like with individuals, right? It just doesn't go away one day when it's over. And there's this historical, let me just read this to you, if you'll let me read this, because I found it in that book that I keep recommending. And I'll recommend it at the end, show the thing again, but it's that one about recently published, a compilation of essays and different works from different Ukrainians. And it's just priceless. I keep reading it and rereading parts of it because it's so good. And this idea of historical memory, after going through what they've gone through, well, this is the problem. Here we go. So we Ukrainians often want to be perceived as a nation of righteous people and great martyrs. But righteous people and great martyrs live hand in hand with executioners, accomplices, traitors, and those who remain indifferent. All of this hides a terrible trauma that we are not ready to discuss, because almost every single one of us is fighting a silent internal war. We basically do not know whose descendants we are, and they don't, and how our ancestors managed to survive, at whose expense or which expense, thanks to what, in spite of what our ancestors survived during the Holodomor, that's the big famine we'll talk about. Repressions, cleansings, revolutions, civil war, killings. Perhaps some of our ancestors violated the rules and were able to save a loaf of bread. Perhaps someone used another person as a shield. Perhaps some were hiding behind their status and committed crimes. This is like having bipolar disorder, an illness that we all seem to suffer from. Suddenly an executioner during the famine or World War II, who was a completely Soviet person, became a Ukrainian. And now we have to be ashamed of this fact. On the other hand, this Ukrainian hero from Ukraine's resistance movement was killing Soviet people who were ethnic Ukrainians. So how can we say he or she is a hero? See, it's all mixed up. I mean, that really hit me. When I read that this morning, because well, there's this collective guilt for the survivors to deal with. I mean, when 4 million people die of starvation and cannibalism is part of it, it's so humiliating what they did to survive. The survivors are like, there's this guilt around survival. And I mean, this is not a new, I think people that are, what's it called, Stockholm syndrome and that kind of thing, where survival guilt. I mean, this country, the entire country has it. And now they're all mashed together. The Russians, the Ukrainians, the whole bunch of them. It's all kind of in this one new place. And you don't want to know everybody's ancestries and what they did. There's Ukrainians that were incredibly complicit in killing Jews in pogroms and stuff. And you talk a lot about the Holocaust in Ukraine. And I'm sorry to say, but there was a lot of Ukrainians that facilitated it. Now, what do you do with that? Right? What if you knew your grandfather was somehow part of that? I mean, they haven't done what the Germans did. The Germans did this sort of national cleansing thing about the Holocaust, where they acknowledged it, they documented it, they fessed up to everything, and they just, tried to get past it, tried to get a reconciliation, acknowledge it, and then get past it. Ukrainians haven't done decommunization, right? They still have this echo and this taste of communism in their whole world, which is part of the corruption problem and part of the complicity some Ukrainians had in this whole bad story. Because like you said, a partisan Ukrainians killing Russians who, again, that doesn't tell you anything. They could be completely have a Ukrainian ancestor. Those two worlds, those two cultures are so intermixed. You can't just separate them. Ukrainians are here and the Russians are over here. For 700 years, they've been all mixed up together. And sometimes they're forcibly, Stalin took a whole bunch of them and exiled them to the central part of Russia. And now some of them are trickling, the Tartars, the Crimean Tartars, the Cossacks, they were there. The Cossacks are like our Aboriginals, our Native Americans. The Cossacks, they were there first, this nomadic people. And Stalin took millions of them and forcibly relocated them to Central Asia. And now they're coming back. And their home was the Crimea. They're called the Crimean Tartars. And they're like, it's like if our native Aboriginal people called, Native Americans were trying to get off the reservation, trying to move back into society, which is now alien and white and not anything that they would recognize. So this is the kind of stuff they're dealing with collectively. And they're very xenophobic about it. They don't like the Tartars. They're kind of crazy and, and yet they're the Aboriginals. And they don't know how to deal with that. And it wasn't their fault that Stalin exiled them to Siberia. And now that they want to come back to their original home, of course, their original home is full of Ukrainians. So where do you buy a house when, you're this other guy called a Tartar? Because they're Muslims.
Yeah.
Their religion isn't Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. They are, for 700 years, they've been Muslims. And now they're coming back into a Christian country. And that's a problem, right? But this is like the kind of stuff they're dealing with right this moment.
Yeah.
And that's why this book I recommend goes into this struggle that you never hear. You'll never hear it on the news. You'll never hear it any place. I've never heard any of this stuff anywhere but Ukraine. We have this very heroic notion of Ukrainians, I think, based on what we see them doing with the Russians. But we can't be too blind to the dark side of all this, because every society, we got our dark side. Our problem was slavery, Civil War. We got all that, right? Good luck doing ancestry if you're a African-American. It stops on the plantation. There are no names. There's just ages and, there's no identity of those slaves.
Puts a lot
So,
of pressure on them,
it's just-
the purity that we look at them with now
Yeah.
because of this war.
Yeah.
I remember one time when the movie Dances with Wolves came out,
Jeez.
and I have Native heritage, and I have some friends that made a comment about that movie, and they said, it's a beautiful film, filmed beautifully and all the rest of that. That is not who we are, and it makes us a victim in a way because now we're expected to be this
Well,
way,
it's the old,
and we are not that way.
it's the old noble savage,
Say again,
the noble savage,
yes,
right? I mean, that's what Kevin Costner did with that movie.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't show
the true life, yeah,
Indians killing Indians. It just doesn't go there.
yeah,
It's they're noble savages, and that's an old story
Yeah.
too, right? So,
yeah, they didn't all count coup, they really killed somebody sometimes, yeah.
Well, they had a little bit there in Dances and Wolf, that one tribe, came in and killed savages on savages there.
yeah, it's just that we tend to, history makes us romanticize some things that,
well,
yeah, it's just part of, and again, there's there's another guy, are you the one who read Bloodlands?
Bloodlands, yeah,
Bloodlands? That's the other book I was gonna recommend.
yeah,
Um,
that is one that changes you forever, I think,
And a lot of this material came from that kind
yeah,
of thing, but the historian, Timothy Snyder, I know you've probably seen this guy on TV, but you don't remember his name. He's interviewed constantly, Timothy Snyder. And if you go on YouTube and just search for Timothy Snyder, he's a historian at Yale.
put that on Amy.
Yeah, I will too, yeah.
Yeah,
And I got into a lecture he gave in the Ukraine. He speaks fluent Ukrainian. He's not like one of these American historians who can't speak the language of the people he claims to be expert about. And he was giving a seminar, a lecture in the Ukraine with college students. And it's absolutely fascinating. I'll send a link to it because it gets into a lot of this stuff, because the only people that are going to save the Ukrainians are these 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds. I mean, Zelensky's only 30 something, right? His whole administration is really young.
yeah,
What do we have? A bunch of septuagenarians. I'm sorry, I'm sick of having 70 and 80-year-old presidents. Just one of those things that where are young people? Anyway, forget that. But Timothy Snyder just has a way of articulating the notions of history and how people learn it and what they're taught about history. And he does it in a whole new way. I'll send a few links.
yeah,
But he wrote Bloodlands.
Bloodlands, yeah,
A book that never had been written. I mean, nobody knew about the Hitler Stalin thing and how Ukraine is in the center of every single thing. You want to talk about Europe? Ukraine's at the middle of every discussion about Europe there is. But anyway, so how are we doing here on time?
I'm reading now, Lennon's Poem.
Oh, yeah, I've heard a lot
And that's
about that. I haven't
very-
read that one.
That's really an interesting one too. Kind of parallels what you've been saying here, which is nice.
Let's see. That's okay. Now, USB ports. I just think there's a lot that Americans ought to learn about what Ukraine's been through and what they're going through. We are well to know about it, not just because it's Russia and it's Putin and all that. It's, because we're actually, and Timothy Snyder really gets into this, which is, again, he brings things up like this that I never heard about. If you think about all the European countries, we think they're all really old. I mean, Britain's really old. France is pretty old. But all the Eastern European countries, the old Iron Curtain countries, they're brand new countries. They didn't exist until after World War I, and not really until after World War II. And not really until the Soviet Union fell apart. And their histories start in the 20th century. We're 260 years old or something. We're really an old country. And yet we think we're young. And we're totally not young. We're really old now, or middle-aged at least. But all these other countries we think are old in Europe, they're all, they're really young and they haven't sorted out all the stuff that we're, And it's just an interesting perspective because the other theme tonight is going to be empire. It's like, what do you do after the empire's gone? I mean, when the Russian Empire fell apart, another empire replaced it called communism and the Bolsheviks. It's an empire. I mean, Ukraine is a colonial state to Russia, the USSR. And every one of the European countries, except for the really old ones, are really new. And the only way they're all too small to like prosper on their own. They're very small, but when they joined the European Union, they had this collective resource, collective rule of law, and it made all of them a lot stronger. And now the Ukrainians are in the same boat, right? Can they thrive on their own, separate from the EU, separate from Russia? And no one's been able to do that yet, right? Can they become prosperous? Because right now they're really suffering. They have no foreign investment. They're too corrupted to the, you know. And so they want to join the European Union. It's like, that's what you have to do after an empire is gone.
Yeah.
You've got to group yourself with others like you for strength. Hey, guys.
With America going in and say Germany, Britain, whoever, and rebuilding the Ukraine, hopefully if there is still a Ukraine. Then this is-
Oh, yeah, I'm sure there will be.
Yeah. That should bring them up to warp speed to,
Well, I'll tell you what, if you look at the European Union, they're in discussions right now. It's called the, what's it called? It's the pre-agreement you make with the European Union so that you will be sometime qualified to become a member of the European Union. You just don't one day become a member of the EU, right? There's an agreement you sign and it outlines all the things you've got to do to meet the criteria to become a member of the EU. I mean, Turkey signed the same document that Ukrainians are about to sign to become a member of the EU. In 1962, Turkey signed that. They're still not in the EU.
I
Hey,
have
hey,
a
guys.
question for you. With Sweden and Finland about to join supposedly NATO,
Well, maybe.
does Ukraine, have they had an interest in joining NATO, and how close are they to the qualifications?
Well, I mean,
To join NATO.
well, again, just to use the Turkey thing, right? Turkey has not at all been, and probably, I don't know if they ever will be formalized as a member of the European Union, but they've been a member of NATO for quite a while now.
Oh, Turkey is?
Yeah.
I guess I didn't realize that. Okay.
And now that's a problem because they're vetoing the Finnish and Swedish members trying to become members of
Oh, I did not
NATO.
know that. Yeah, oh, really?
Yeah, and so is Hungary. I mean, those are,
Oh, well, that's.
the problem is with joining NATO, one country, one existing NATO country can veto the entry of any other new country into the thing.
So it's not just a majority or
No.
something, a majority, it's one.
And all it takes is Erdogan in Turkey to say no, because they've got some Kurdish people living there that we hate. So unless they kick the Kurds out of Sweden and Finland, we're going to veto their membership in NATO, which is, of course, exactly what Vladimir Putin wants to hear. Right. But, so it's a lot trickier than,
Yeah.
But just the
I
fact-
did not know some of that.
but just the fact that just the fact that they are abandoning their neutrality for decades and decades and now lining up with Europe and NATO is plenty right there in a lot of ways, right? I mean, it doesn't mean they have the,
Sure.
well, should we start? I guess we are starting or have started. Okay, so thanks for coming back. We're gonna, like I said, well, I don't know why I'm telling you this makeup thing because the people that want the makeup aren't here. But we are gonna do a makeup session because there were a number of people that had the commitments. The deeper you get into spring and summer, the more that happens, I think. So I think everything we've talked about up to now, which is pretty much Russia-centric history, We're going to try to, and you can't disconnect Russia from Ukrainian history, but we're really trying to focus on Ukraine. So, and now just as a reminder, should I kill the lights or? I think it's the one all the way in the back there. So remember Putin said this, we're gonna refer to this a lot in different ways. The fact that this whole notion about Ukraine being a country is a fantasy. It's never been its own country. He denies it completely as a sovereign country and disavows the fact that at the fall of the Soviet Union, it and 14 other republics of the Soviet Union became independent countries. But that's okay, but not these guys. These are Russians, their history is Russian, and all that. So just keep that in mind, because most of the tactics that Vladimir Putin is using right now presumes that, well, we're not invading, we're not violating anybody's sovereignty in our invasion. You can't invade a country if it's not a country to begin with. So it's okay. Anyway. So let's just, we need to, I think, do a flyby of just sort of one more time, the timeline of the big events that really make the Ukraine the center of European history in a lot of ways. So we're going to go back in time and roll it forward just so we're on the same historical timeline here. So remember, in 1240, the Mongols invaded. Remember, we had that thing called the Kievan Rus, that ancient medieval, but very democratic, rules-based thing called the Kievan Rus. Mongols had invaded, and pretty much that was the end of that. But it may have been the end of the old Kievan Rus country, but the culture and the laws lived on. So how did that work? So you remember, I'm just going to refresh your memory so that you remember in that 13th century, the Mongols, the Golden Horde went through Russia. I mean, they were trying to get to the middle of Europe. They failed, but again, that is what killed off the old Kievan Rus Republic. And it was replaced by this thing that we have never talked about, and I don't want to get into because it's super complicated. In 1569, called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's this gigantic state that was created in the 16th and 17th century. And this is how big it was. I mean, here's Kiev, here's Ukraine, here's Poland, here's Austria, here's the Baltic states. I mean, this thing called this Commonwealth was a huge state, and it swallowed up everybody until about 1770. Everything east of that one big gigantic state that wasn't touched by it was the part of the old Russian. That's where Moscow was born, which was separate from all these European. So what this means is most of that Polish-Lithuanian culture is European. It's not Eurasian Russian. And so they were Kiev, and the Ukrainians at the time were able to actually participate in the Renaissance, Enlightenment, Reformation, those key traditional milestones for Europe. Kiev, and therefore Ukraine, took part in it because they really at that point were part of a gigantic European culture. However, everything east of it, which was Russian and Russia and Moscow, missed all that. They knew nothing about the Renaissance, the Reformation, Enlightenment. Russian didn't take part in it. Kiev and the Ukrainians did take part in it. Now to 1863, remember this is the date that The Tsar at the time, Alexander II, emancipated the serfs almost exactly when we emancipated, when Lincoln emancipated our slaves. A lot of things happened in the 1860s. One of them is that gigantic Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fell apart. And not just the Ukraine, but a whole bunch of new national movements began. The next big milestone in the Ukrainian timeline here is the defeat as the end of World War I. And this is true of all kinds of countries. When Austria, Germany collapsed and the Russian Empire collapsed at the end of World War I, a whole bunch of brand new nation states were created. That's why I was just talking about all these Poland, Czechoslovakia, none of these countries really existed until after World War I. When a bunch of really smart people got together in Paris and just read that book about the end of World War I, where a bunch of folks carved up the world. They created the Middle East. They drew the boundaries that became Iraq, and all that was created after World War I, including all these boundaries and countries. However, Ukraine was not part of that. Ukraine stayed in Russia, and it was not at that time after World War I created as a separate, brand new country. So if you think Hungary's old, or Poland's old, or any of those are old countries, they're not, they're new, if you know what I mean. We also learned, and then I think the third session, that the creation of the thing we call the Soviet Union, and we're gonna, again, get into this in detail in a minute, without Ukraine, there may not have been a thing called the Soviet Union. So just hold that thought. And then, as Timothy Snyder likes to say, Ukraine became the most dangerous place in the world between the years 1933 and 1945, because Stalin had just taken over the Soviet Union, and he was going to industrialize the whole country, colonize all the parts of the world that were not part of the original Russia. And at the same time, Hitler came to power in 1933, and his entire focus was to invade not Great Britain and not that Western Europe so much as invade Eastern to the east, mainly with the target being the Ukraine. We'll get into that in a minute too. So again, this is just sort of a quick snapshot of time. 1991, of course, the USSR collapsed, and then the sovereign state called Ukraine was born, despite Putin saying it didn't happen. The next one is 2014. This is the other gigantic date on the Ukrainian calendar, which is the Maidan Revolution, 2014. And that was about the European Union. That was about a pathway out of corruption for the Ukraine, which is still the biggest project they have. And then, of course, that revolution generated Putin's the original war in the eastern part of the country, where he invaded the Ukraine in the east, and he stole Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula. So that's just kind of the big dates. And I think the theme here is, again, what does a country do after you're not a part of an empire anymore? And Bolshevik Revolution. So immediately after World War I, and during the time where the Bolsheviks took over Russia, and say 1922, when the Soviet Union was actually created as a thing, Ukraine was occupied 12 times by different countries it's too complicated to ever talk in this kind of a session, but between that period of about 1917 through 1922, Ukraine was occupied 12 times. There were civil wars. There was the huge, horrific Reds versus the Whites, post-Bolshevik Revolution civil war within Russia. And the Ukrainians were stepped on from both sides. They were brutalized by the Whites and the Reds, and again, Poles, so 1917, the Tsar's army in World War I. This is, when there was still the collapse of the Russian Empire. Remember all the Russian soldiers? There was one last big offensive that they were crushed and they all just walked out, got out of the trenches and walked home. You ever watch Dr. Zhivago? Watch it again. It's really good. It's historical. So one month after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Ukrainian people actually, who had been working on a notion of becoming a republic before they even could, created and declared their own independent country called the Ukrainian People's Republic in Kiev. And this is what the map they drew looked like back then. And so they, on their own, said, okay, so the Russian Empire is dead. And there's nothing to replace it yet. The Bolsheviks are still kind of getting their act together in Leningrad or Moscow. So they take the opportunity to declare their own independent sovereign state. And this is the map that they drew. You can see it pretty much. I mean, it's on the Black Sea. You can see, the Crimea. So they were right out of the gate about to wanting to create their own independent country. And that was in October 27, 1917, which was almost to the day, or that was the month that the Bolsheviks overthrew the old Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, and that empire, and pretty much had the coup that took over, the communist Bolsheviks took over Russia, October 17th, the same exact time. Ukraine puts a map and says, this is our country. Problem is, the Bolsheviks, more than any other thing, beyond the Moscow, Leningrad part of Russia they wanted the Ukraine more than anything. Why? Because that's where all the food comes from. And then you're going to hear that about 100 times. So the Bolshevik Red Guards, again, this is not the Soviet Union yet. We're still a few years away from the Soviet Union being created. But the Bolshevik Red Guards, they defeat and invade Kiev. Again, this is right after they put that map up and said, this is our country. And the Ukrainians didn't have their own army or anything, but they had a bunch of military cadets and armed students. And this is a picture of a lot of these people that were the first people that the Red Guards, the Bolshevik Red Guards, encountered when they came into that part of what we call northern Ukraine and Kiev. And unfortunately, they were defeated by the much stronger Red Guards. So now you've got a Kiev, despite having declared sort of its independence, or that it's trying to form that state around that map, they are now occupied by the Bolsheviks. And so they make a deal. At the same time, remember, World War I is still active. The Germans have not surrendered yet. And so, but the German army, particularly in that part of the world where Ukraine is today, was running out of food. I mean, they had a big problem. And Ukraine cut a deal with them that, listen, German Austrian army, if you come in and drive the Bolsheviks out of Kiev, get the Red Army out of here, we'll give you all the food you want to feed your armies with. That's the deal. And in return for giving them food and getting rid of the Bolsheviks, we'll even let you basically create a German authority, not a German state necessarily, but we'll let you kind of run us. Just get the the communists out of here. We'll give you food and you can run us for a while, which is pretty smart thing to do, I thought. And then just a little bit later, November of 18, German armies defeated on the Western Front. Right out of that, instantly, the Ukrainians declare the same Ukrainian People's Republic. Like, okay, we were really smart hooking up with the Germans because they had lost. So now we got our country back and there's no Reds and there's no Germans. So let's declare our independence again. Smart. I mean, this tells you how passionate these people are about independence and sovereignty. This is not some new thing. I mean, so they do that. Unfortunately, the Red Guard Bolsheviks show up again in February 19 and reoccupy Kiev. And these are the Red Guards, a good picture of the Red Guards that came in and took back Ukraine, Kiev for Lenin. And then it's kind of over, right? At this point, now we go December 22, and now the Republic is created within a new thing called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So remember, this isn't Russia. Russia, as we have it today with Vladimir Putin running it, as an independent country, never existed. The USSR was a confederation of republics, of which the Russian Republic was one. The second Russian Republic was the Ukrainian Russian Republic. And so this is sort of the official seal of, well, this one's the official seal of the USSR with all of its republics that it, Kazakhstan, all those other republics of the old USSR. But the first one was the Ukraine Republic. It had its own seal, it had its own boundaries. It was a republic. It just lived within the context of the Soviet Union, not the Russian country. It wasn't a Russian country yet. That didn't happen until 1991, when this all fell apart. And I just think it's interesting if you look at this original, the sort of coat of arms, if you will, of the Ukraine Republic back then. It's in Ukrainian, not in Russian. That means something. This side, it says, Proletariat стран соединяйтесь. It says, workers of the world unite in Russian and workers of the world unite in Ukrainian. So they've already sort of fessed up to the notion that this is a bilingual country. Again, Putin doesn't want you to think that Ukraine is a bilingual country. It's a Russian-speaking country, and it's a bilingual country. Now, the incredible irony here for me is the creation in December 22 of the thing called the Soviet Union was a treaty with Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And that was the beginning, the core of what became the bigger, much bigger Soviet Union. And I'll just refresh your memory from a couple of weeks ago, where this is the signing of the agreement that dissolved the Soviet Union. in 1991. Who is dissolving it? The Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and Russian Republic. So the same exact republics that created the Soviet Union in 1922 are exactly the same republics that dissolved it in 1991. And Ukraine is, without Ukraine, because it is, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Would either of those two events happen the way that they did? Don't think so. I mean, but it's. Okay, so now let's get into this interwar period, right? So now, 1920, 1939. When Vladimir Lenin first created the Bolshevik Revolution and the whole first generation of what would become the Soviet Union in 1922, it was called war communism, the very beginnings of it. And it was instant nationalization of everything. It was forcible subscription into the Red Army, no matter where you lived or no matter what your allegiance was. And it was the forcible requisitioning of food to feed, particularly the people in the north, up where Leningrad, Moscow is. And it was such a chaotic situation, and it created a famine right there, not to mention destroying a lot of economic things they were trying to do, that 1 million Ukrainians died of starvation just in 1920. Now you're going to lose track of how many times this occurs over time in this slide, but remember that's the first one. And it was such a devastating setback for the Bolsheviks and for Lenin that he took a breath and said, okay, wait a minute, maybe we better rethink this thing. War communism was this brutal, instant transformation from an empire to this new communist state. And it was so fast and so brutal, it just broke everything. And it threatened the very existence of the Bolshevik project. So he suspends war communism. And the first thing he does, he says, you know, we got to rethink this idea of the nationalities that are in the sphere of influence that we want the Bolshevik Soviet communist thing to become. We have all these other nationalities. And we can't apparently, based on what just happened in 1920, we can't just go in there and make them part of us. They won't tolerate it. We're creating havoc and chaos. Rethink time. And he suspends that. And the first thing he does is, this is his words, he accommodates Ukrainian national feelings. This is Vladimir Lenin saying, Ukrainians are the most important republic we want right now. Again, it's the breadbasket of not only Russia, but Europe and a whole bunch of other places. We're going to let them be for a while. We're going to roll back this war communism. And he restores some limited private enterprise, most notably private ownership of agricultural land. Remember, at this time, 88% or something of the people who live in what we call Ukraine are farmers. They're agrarian. They are, you know, and we're going to let them keep their land as their ownership, which is a gigantic concession. This is not communism anymore. And we're going to give the Ukrainian language equal standing, which is why that thing I just showed you, when they created the Soviet Union 2 years later, had a bilingual nature to it. Because Lenin said, you know, let them have their language, let them have their land, and we'll get back to communism and a new thing. It was called the New Deal, or no, it's called the new economic plan. That's what we call it. And we'll get to Soviet Russia a little bit later, but first we're going to do this. And again, if the Ukrainians had like gone along with things, I don't know if that would have happened. Problem is, this guy comes along. And Lenin dies in 1924. Stalin creates the most important thing ever created in the Soviet Union was his first 5-year plan, which was this notion of leap forward, this agrarian backward agricultural based country and leap forward into a modern competitive industrial country. And he's going to do it 2 ways: rapid industrialization and collectivization of all the farms. So that was the 5-year plan, the first 5-year plan. There were many to come. And sure enough, it worked in a lot of ways. Industrial output happened, factories were built, dams were built. Workers leaving the villages are working in factories. The urban population grows to 34%. But to get there, he tries to collectivize agriculture. And that means undoing what Lenin just did, which was now forcibly taking agricultural land from entrepreneurial peasant farmers who owned their land. And they had no choice. And I think Stalin called them peasants of questionable politics. It's like if they want to hold on to their land and resist collectivization of agriculture, they got to go. That we're not going to tolerate that. And so 100,000, they were called kulaks. I'm sure you've heard the term. 100,000 of these kulaks, which were the entrepreneurs of Russian Ukrainian agriculture. They're the ones that hired other peasants to work the land and paid them for it because they had the money, they maybe had some equipment. They were either killed, dispossessed, or deported mainly to Kazakhstan, which is that big giant country that borders on Iran to the east. And so then, and again, Ukraine Orthodox Church was brutalized big time. So this led to the famine of 1932, 1933, called the Holodomor. And it's really it's a Ukrainian word that means holod, which is like starvation, and the Holodomor means intentional starvation. It's starving somebody on purpose. That's what the word really means. And this resistance to Soviet rule, who Lenin had sort of accommodated, Stalin, being Stalin, of course, is not going to accommodate that. He saw the Ukraine as a threat to the whole Soviet project, the whole Soviet empire, the regime. And it is an empire, by the way. So he gets into this thing where he wants to destroy the entire culture around agriculture, which he did. I mean, up to that point, Ukrainian culture was based on the village. That was the culture, the village, not cities or any of that yet. And through his forcible confiscation of grain, and that's what's going on here, where these trains, they would come in and go to a farmer's crops that have been harvested and forcibly throw them on wagons and take them north up into Russia. To the extent that the numbers are impossible to get to, let's just say 4 million Ukrainians starved to death in the breadbasket of Europe and Asia because their crops were forcibly requisitioned, was their fancy word for it, and taken away from them. And the grain was actually called socialist property, which means if you try to hoard a little bit and stash it away somewhere in the basement, that's a capital crime. You get shot for it. Right. So at the same time in 1933, particularly the worst year, when this is going on and all this output of agriculture is being forcibly moved out of the Ukrainian agriculture, the Soviet Union exported 1 million tons of grain to the West to get money. So it's not like there wasn't grain. It's not like there was a famine because of climate or who knows. Anyway, what else can you say about that? Now, the Holodomor. Again, this is a picture of Soviet guards taking crops from Ukrainian farmers to be redistributed basically to the north where you can't grow grain like this. And I didn't know this until I got in. I don't know, you ever see this in Washington? The Holodomor monument, it's in Washington, DC. And I'd never heard of it, and I didn't know, I mean, I didn't know because you spent time there for a long time. And yet, back in, I'll look at the date in a minute, but it was in 1990 something. This really astonishing memorial to the Holodomor genocide was put up in Washington, DC.
Do you have a location of that memorial?
Not off the top of
Because
my
I'm
head.
from that area and I've been to many bazillion, I grew up there. I mean, I've never heard of it.
I don't know, but I could be easy to find out. Obviously, you're looking for the street sign. It's like, where is that,
Yeah.
right? Because it's right there in Washington, DC. And so, again, this is genocide, right? This isn't famine, this is genocide. This is what, and in 1948, after World War II, the United Nations had a convention where they defined what genocide is. They wanted to formalize what that means. It's having the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And this is just one of these million pictures you stop watching real fast of dead, starved people, in this case in Kharkov in Ukraine, or Kharkov. I mean. So Sputnik, there are two English-speaking current Russia propaganda TV networks that Putin has set up. One is called RT, and one is called Sputnik. And they are for English speakers. And this is something that was published on Sputnik in 2015, which is when that, 2015, which is when that memorial in Washington, DC was created. And this is what you hear today about the Holodomor in Putin's Russia. It's a hoax, the crime that never took place, playing in the hands of Ukrainian nationalists, a monument to the so-called Ukrainian Holodomor, one of the 20th century's most famous myths and vitriolic pieces of anti-Soviet propaganda has been erected in the US Capitol. So this isn't something that was written back in the old Soviet days. This was written a few minutes ago in 2015. This is what, and I'm just going to say this once tonight. This is the shit that Fox News puts up on their network. They run Sputnik shit all the time. Okay, I'm done. And that was for you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I also found the location of
You find
the memorial. It's on Massachusetts Avenue, right near the Postal Museum there.
I
It's
never.
very close to the Capitol building, actually.
Yeah, next time you're in Washington.
I know, yeah.
So there's something about this whole thing about the Ukraine being the breadbasket of Europe, right? So again, I'm not a chemist or anything, but this black, you've heard of the Black Earth, maybe, right? And this is where the so-called Chernozem, how do you say it? Chernozem, yeah, which is this naturally occurring deep, not, it's like, I mean, how many meters deep? And it's naturally contains high percent of humus, phosphoric acid, phosphorus, and ammonia. All the stuff you buy at a nursery to put in your garden, right? To make stuff grow. It's just there. And this is the one place on the planet, except for a little bit in Canada that spills over into North Dakota. There's a little bit of it. But this is where it is. This amazing stuff called the Black Earth with this, you know, and you know, this is Ukraine. Right, so if you wonder why now people are worried about this war that's going on right now, and all the foodstuffs that are not leaving Odessa and Mariupol in those ports because of the war, they're not going to be going to the Middle East and to, that rely on this stuff. But again, this is why so many empires have targeted Ukraine, particularly Hitler and Stalin. So,
Randy,
yes.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I did have a question when you were showing the timeline and you go like from 1563, then you have the Polish Lithuanian part. But that leaves out Catherine the Great because I read this
Yeah.
book that said she moved these Germans, ethnic Germans into Ukraine.
Yeah.
To farm there, and they were actually, there was a true story, somebody here in Montana left from the Ukraine,
Yeah.
settled in Montana after World War II. From
Yeah.
that region.
Yeah. No, I love Catherine the Great. Absolutely. I mean, remember Peter the Great, who preceded her, did the same kind of thing. And he wanted the Black Sea. Remember, he wanted a port. It's a landlocked country, so he wanted to have a port that could get him out to the Mediterranean or the Atlantic. So he had Peter's huge obsession was taking over the Black Sea from the Ottoman Turks. He only got this far. He got to the Azov Sea, that piece, and then he had to stop. Catherine the Great finished the job, right? She extended the old Russian Empire down to, well, exactly what you just said.
So that be said, so is Putin right in saying that it was part of the Russian Empire, the Ukraine was, and that's why he wants it back? Because of Catherine the Great, I mean, is that a lot?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely part of his rationale. And I think I mentioned last week that during the COVID lockdown thing in Russia, he spent most of his time in the basement of the Kremlin going over Catherine's maps and how she changed all those borders and took them into the empire. And his logic is, well, hell, if she can do it, I can do it. His lesson isn't that borders are sacred like we think. His lesson is they're totally fluid. And if you're strong enough, you take them, you change it. And that's Catherine the Great. He's trying to be Catherine. Thank you. So, there's another guy. Adolf Hitler comes to power in 1933. In 1926, he's in prison in Germany, and he writes Mein Kampf, right? And these are just excerpts from Mein Kampf, where right out of the gate, he's still in prison. He's not in charge of anything yet, but he's thinking of Germany creating an empire, just like Stalin is creating an empire by collecting republics in the old Soviet Union. Hitler is not satisfied with being locked into Germany. He wants an empire. He can't create what Britain did for all those years, which is a maritime empire, right? So he has to look to the east. And the only way to rival Great Britain is to conquer Eurasia, right? Which is Ukraine is part of Eurasia, Kazakhstan, all those places. I need Ukraine. He calls out Ukraine in Mein Kampf. So no one can starve us out again as they did in the last war, World War I. Spread the German Empire to the east, to the land of the inferior Slavic people who should be enslaved and their natural resources confiscated. That was Hitler's most grand, his plan. Wasn't the Western Front, it was the Eastern Front. And I'm sure you remember 1939, Stalin and Hitler created this non-aggression pact. Stalin is trying to create some kind of peace with Hitler, and they kind of carve up things here. Yeah. So the deal between the two lovers here, is that it'll be okay with Russia. Russia won't lift a finger when the Nazis invade Poland and these other countries. And in return, the deal is Russia will take over this part of Poland. Germans will keep this part, and the Russians will get the Baltic states and Belarus. They kind of just carved it up that way. Didn't last long like this, by the way. This was the original sort of deal. And so, again, you know, some of these, you know, parts of Poland and Romania, et cetera, actually became part of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is one time when the Ukrainian state or republic grew based on that deal with Hitler. But of course, that didn't last. I mean, in, you know, June 41, 3.5 million German soldiers invade Russia. And if you say invade Russia, you're not saying it right. Where they actually invade, here's Moscow and Leningrad, and they certainly, as we talked about a couple of times, the siege of Leningrad was awful. But what they wanted and what they conquered was this part. Not, they didn't get this far. This is the Ukraine and Belarus. Here's the Black Sea, Ukraine. So the brunt of Hitler's third, you know, Eastern Front was much more impactful to the Ukrainians than the Russians to the north. Now, when that invasion started, again, you know, there were 225,000 Ukrainian political prisoners in prisons spread all over the place in Ukraine, because they are always causing trouble for Stalin. So he's putting all these people in there, and as they leave, as the Russians retreat, he has all the political prisoners in Kiev murdered, shot, 225,000 of them killed. September 41, Germany gets to Kiev, and 665,000 Russian/Ukrainian soldiers surrender. A lot of them think this could be okay because Stalin, Hitler, maybe we should join the Germans against Stalin, right? I mean, I probably think that way because you don't know what Hitler's going to really thinking about. I don't know. Of course, that's a fantasy. But again, this is another reason why Stalin shot everybody questionable before the Germans got there, so they wouldn't join the fight with Germany. So the Germans, of course, established 160 POW camps to put all these now surrendered Russian military in. And they're open air, and that's really important because there was zero production from the weather, from the brutal winters, and it was just a killing field for POWs, for Ukrainian and Russian, you know, Russian POWs. And 2.5 million young Ukrainians became slave labor in Germany, shipped off to Germany. And many of them were killed in Allied bombing attacks later against Germany in those factories. They were full of Ukrainians who'd been forced slave labor in Germany. So, you know, Ukraine's simultaneously fighting for the two most brutal tyrants ever created. And they're also focused on where they live. Now, the Holocaust. Again, this is all new news to me. The Holocaust in Ukraine started in 1941. was the first phase of what we now think of as the Holocaust. And well, you can read it, 1.5 million Jews were shot. This is before Treblinka. These are before the industrialized killing centers were created, Auschwitz and them. They don't exist yet at all. So the way you kill Jews is with a bullet and a gun. You don't have trains to ship them off to Auschwitz. That's going to come a couple of years later. That's why it's called the Holocaust by bullet. And I'd never heard that term until recently, but that is a formal name of this early part of the Holocaust. And if you look at the present map, 1 in every 4 Jewish victims of the Holocaust at large were murdered in the Ukraine. Before World War II, there were 2.5 million Jews living in the Soviet Republic in the Ukraine, the Soviet Republic of Ukraine, which was the largest Jewish population within the Soviet Union and one of the largest in Europe. Only 100,000 of those 2.5 million Ukrainian Jews survived Nazi occupation. Today, right now, Jews only represent 0.4% of the religion that's practiced in the Ukraine today. So, but at the time of the start of the World War II, Kiev was 20% Jewish, Judea belief and everything. Now it's 0.4% Judaic belief. And so that just tells you how these events show up today in terms of religious practice and all the rest. So September now, Germany gets to Kiev. And one thing the Soviets did, and clearly the Ukrainians were part of this too, is that they booby-trapped the whole city of Kiev before the Germans could get there. And they had these mines that were embedded in all the major, like big buildings and all over the place. And they were timed to go off some weeks or days, weeks after the Germans came in and occupied all that space. And so these huge explosions went off in Kiev, caused by these mines, timed to explode, and it destroyed the German headquarters. It killed thousands of troops and officers, Russian of the Nazi army. And I mean, it was really effective in that regard. But it led to this huge retribution against Jews primarily. And remember, by this time, most of the men are gone. Most of the men are conscripted. They are out of the city, the country, fighting. They've been relocated. They're POWs or something. So who's left in Ukraine, in Kiev? Women and children, not only, but predominantly. The men are off fighting. September 20, and I went to this place when I was there. In 2 days, the Germans killed 34,000 Jews. And it's called Babi Yar. You've probably heard of Babi Yar. And this part of the memorial is just sort of recognizing the number of children that were part of that 34,000. And even this got caught up in the politics of these two countries. So prior to, all during the communist, rule of Russia, of Soviet Union, there was no memorial at Babi Yar in the Ukraine until a Russian poet wrote a poem. This is back in the late 60s, early 70s. And the title of the poem is "There is no memorial in Babi Yar." And the poem was, it just reached such a circulation and it got everywhere. And it even became the first few lines of Shostakovich's, one of his symphonies. Anyway, it created this impetus finally for the Soviets to create a memorial, not to the Jews, but to the Soviet citizens. That's what it says. There's two memorials. This is the one that was put up by the Soviets in '76, dedicated to Soviet citizens shot at Babi Yar without the slightest mention of Jews. And it was all Jewish, killed there. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, a separate memorial was put up at the same location, obviously identifying the Jewish victims, right? So even there, we've got this crazy post-communist, pre-communist thing going on at places like this. I mean, and I was there, and it's, yeah. Can't get your head around that many people in that short a time. And then it just gets worse, I'm afraid. So at the beginning, these killing units, they were called, were looking for Jews, just male Jews primarily, during the invasion of the Soviet Union. But then it went after everybody. It was a genocide, women, children, everybody. Obviously, Babi Yar is full of children and women. Problem with Holocaust by bullets is it's really hard on the German soldiers who have to do this. They have their limits. I mean, how many people can you shoot with your own gun, right? And I guess it took a toll so much on German soldiers, and it was so inefficient that it led to the decision to create these industrial extermination camp, places like Birkenau and all that, right? And so that's this progression of Holocaust by bullets. It's just not efficient and fast enough, and it's really hard on the troops. So we're going to create Auschwitz. That's how the sequence of how that happened was. Had everybody ever heard this before? I never heard that story before. But it, it's.
Well, I was reading a fiction about a Jewish, the Daniel Silva book, and he went to Babi Yar and that the Germans had to cover up this mass shooting stuff because the smell and the gases
Yeah.
and these trenches were finally becoming a problem.
Right.
And so they sent in someone to do the, burning and the cremation of all those, of those things. And so I think that led
Yeah,
into.
yeah. Unfortunately, you can find all kinds of historical pictures of exactly that happening, but you don't look for them. Yeah, no, yeah. Okay. So we can go through this a little faster, I think. So I heard a lot about the French resistance and other Nazi occupied resistance, partisan movements. I never heard about the Ukrainian resistance during World War II. It's called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, formed in 1941. And it was really big and really successful. Again, just in terms of dates here, Leningrad falls, German retreat back to the west starts in February after the Stalingrad. And in some crazy irony, one of the first army units to reach Auschwitz was the Ukrainian Front Army. It was a lot of Ukrainians were the first ones to actually get to Auschwitz and help capture Berlin. And they had numerous battles, the UPA with German troops, and caused a lot of chaos in the German. And I think most partisan movements were pretty successful too. But again, the Ukrainians are not only fighting Hitler, but they're fighting Soviet security forces as well, right? So in 1945, this is right just after the war, Stalin sends 500,000 men to kill as many of these Ukrainian army insurgents as possible. And they are fighting what the Ukrainians are fighting now: tanks, heavy weapons, aircraft, and even biological warfare. This is At one moment, you're fighting, you're trying to kill German soldiers. Now you're trying to kill Russian soldiers. Depending, this is why they're fighting two wars at the same time. And this is a great quote out of Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs. Ukrainian nationalists gave us more trouble than anyone. After the war, we lost thousands of men in struggle between Ukrainian nationals and the forces of Soviet power. Sound familiar? That's what's happening right now. Except it's not Khrushchev, it's Putin. But the Ukrainian nationalists in political, military, any context you want to talk about them, are an incredible force when they're motivated like this. So just to wrap it up, I don't think we even need to anymore, but there was just, in terms of Ukraine's contribution to the atrocities, more Ukrainians died fighting the Germans than French, American, and British troops combined. Not Russian, that doesn't say Russians fighting the Germans, it says Ukrainians fighting the Germans, greater than French, American, British troops combined. When you hear Putin, like he did 3 weeks ago, talk about the big celebration they have every year of the victory, the victory over Hitler in the Great Patriotic War, does the word Ukrainian come up? No, it's Russians who did that. Well, just to not split hairs here, but it's Ukrainians who did that as part of either their own efforts against Hitler, or as having been conscripted into the Red Army. So World War II, if you just boil it all down, was really about the control of Ukrainians' resources. And it just laid waste to Ukraine completely, obviously. I don't have to say that. So let's get up to now. So, well, not exactly now first. So we have to just remember about July 1990. Again, remember this twice back in in Bolshevik days, Ukrainians declared a state and a map with their state. Well, they did it again, just before the papers were signed, which dissolved the Soviet Union in 91. Well, in December 25th of 1990, they had declared a declaration of state sovereignty of the Ukraine. And it actually went into force at that point, and it detailed that Ukrainian law was predominant over Soviet law. It talked about independence and personal freedoms. And at the time, Ukraine was probably the most prosperous of all the Soviet, I shouldn't say countries, Soviet republics. And ironically, it was the heart of the military-industrial complex for the Soviet Union. So in Kharkov, which is in kind of that northeastern part of Ukraine, they were making, this is back in Soviet days, they were making missiles, heavy aircraft, tanks. Now they're making them against, those factories still exist, although most have been bombed to pieces, like the big one in Mariupol, that big steel factory. That was part of the military thing back in the old days. So anyway, again, Putin would love to establish the military industrial complex he doesn't really have back where it used to be. But here's the problem: at the time that this new thing called the Ukrainian country was created, and this time it's for real, it is created, it's sovereign, it's, you just don't become free. You just don't go from a member of a brutally totalitarian state for 70 years of occupation, which the Ukrainians suffered through. And then one fine day, somebody says, you got your own country, go forth. Well, to this day, they're suffering from Soviet era political corruption. It came with independence. We'll get into that in a minute more. Do you have a monetary system? You do not. You can't trade in rubles, but you're exporting more grain than almost anybody in the world, but you can't, how do you do foreign trade if you don't have your own currency? And even though a lot of products, including tanks and missiles, were made in Ukraine during the Soviet days, when they tried to market that stuff as a free country in foreign markets, they were inferior, as you would expect, probably, right, compared to American arms that are for sale, or German arms, or whoever. The old Russian stuff, as you can see, is junk. I mean, you can see what it takes to take out a Russian T-90 tank, put a grenade in the right place behind that turret, and the whole thing explodes, because the magazine inside the ammunition magazine in the tank is exposed in a way that one grenade can destroy the whole tank and everybody in it. I mean, this is why nobody's could buy any of this stuff from Ukraine, because it was inferior. And of course, Chernobyl, which happened in 1986, is now Ukraine's problem. Right? That's it. That's in the north part of the country. And so instead of Russian paying the bills to clean it up or all that, now the Ukrainians say, hey, we're done with it. Ukraine, you want freedom? You start paying for Chernobyl cleanup and all the rest. That was a gigantic sucking sound on the Ukrainian economy. And like the new Russian Republic, after the Soviet Union fell, who had this gigantic 1990s depression, well, so did Ukraine for the same reasons, hyperinflation, et cetera, et cetera. They weren't immune from that. So they're off to a very rough start, like any country is that is suddenly cut loose from empire. And you're on your own. Magic doesn't just happen, right? But they've been working on it. 1996, they get around to, they have a constitution. They certainly didn't start with a constitution. And it stabilized the political system. It's like, here's how elections happen, and here's how basic, civil society works in a constitution. And then they finally actually created a new currency. They did a lot of monetary reform, so now they can do foreign trade. So, but again, it took a few years to get some basic things in place that you don't start with.
What do they call that currency? How do you pronounce that? HRY?
I can never pronounce it.
Oh, okay. But that's what it's called.
Huh? Sounds good to me. Yeah. Remember, this is where their currency has Yaroslav the Great dressed up as a czar in Russia. Anyway. So the next big event after this creation, after the Soviet Union falls, is the Orange Revolution. So this almost pulled apart the whole country in civil war. It was real close. So two men were vying for president at that time. There was a president before who could have taken a third term. Can't remember his name, but not important. And instead of a third term, he selected Viktor Yanukovych. It's really a shame that these two men's names are so damn similar. They're both Victors, and one is Yanukovych and one is Yushchenko. I still get them mixed up. It's just, why are they both Victor even? Anyway, and so sort of a selected president from the previous one was Yanukovych, who is Putin's guy. He's Ukrainian and he's an oligarch, but he's a Ukrainian oligarch. And he's totally got the whole oligarch pipeline of money going back to Vladimir Putin. But the other guy who's running is Yushchenko. He's running on an anti-corruption, anti-cronyism platform. And he's got two strikes against him right out of the gate. First of all, there's parts of the country, like the real Russian-speaking, Russian kind of leaning parts of the country in the East, where he's not allowed to campaign in the East. And he's the guy they poisoned. We're always talking about poison. So this is Yushchenko before and after being poisoned with dioxin. It wasn't Novichok this time, it was dioxin. And he survived. And he survived to actually keep running for president. But it was real close, the election, and Putin's guy was declared the winner, which generated the Orange Revolution. Everybody thought it was fixed. Nobody believed for a minute that he had won, and he probably didn't win. And they thought it was fraud, and they went to the streets and did the Orange Revolution. So that's the first. Now, before I go any further, like the next phase, we got to talk about corruption here. And let's just break out the different kinds of corruptions that the Ukrainians are so desperate to get past, and yet so hard to get over. So again, like I said, the Ukrainian state at the beginning, which means the end of the Soviet Union, power was seized by former communist bosses who brought Soviet stuff into the political establishment. So right out of the gate, the political establishment of this brand new Ukrainian country is Soviet guys, old Soviet guys. So that's kind of how that's the first problem. So let's just go through these real quickly. These are the categories of corruption that you'll read about. I mean, tax reform has been a huge problem. There's just gigantic amounts of money, $37 billion. Country's overall budget disappeared due to fraudulent tax schemes. Yanukovych, who's the guy who won that election, got, about $9 billion disappeared under his watch, and $2 billion of it went into his family. And this is what you do if you're a Ukrainian oligarch and you're ripping off your country to the tune of billions of dollars. You build a little dacha, right outside of Ukraine. He builds this well, I don't know if this is where all the $2 billion of the went into the family's pockets went, but this is what he built. And if you go inside, now, you never know when Putin's going to drop by for a drink or something. So you want to have you want your crib to look really pretty cool, right? I mean, you never know. This is inside. Of course, if this doesn't say oligarch, man, I don't know what does. Now, we're going to find out in the next thing where he's in the 2013-14 Maidan Revolution. He eventually is thrown out of office. And in the middle of the night, he gets on a plane and flies back to Russia. We'll get to that. But when he left, after the 2014 election or revolution, all these people, all of the Ukrainian protesters and regular citizens were able to go into this place and check out the bed and roam around and try out the golden toilet. And this is just classic, right? This is where the Ukrainian people's billions of dollars of money went. And they finally got to actually sit on the bed. I'm sorry, you can't make this up. So banking has been probably one of the worst areas of the banks are basically giant money laundering Ponzi schemes. Banking was so corrupt that out of 182 banks, 98 of them have been completely liquidated because they were so corrupt in Ukraine over the years, the last, not many years. And now they've been chipping away at these problems, right? So not recent, I think it was primarily not just Zelensky, but the guy before him put some really strict money laundering laws in place to try to get rid of this kind of banking corruption. But that's one big category. Now, this one, I'm not going to take you through. You know this one. This led to the impeachment of Donald Trump. The first impeachment of Donald Trump. Well, I did say it again.
Thank you.
So this guy, you've heard of Firtash, Dimitris Firtash, he's been in the news, particularly back in that period where Trump is calling Zelensky the brand new president, and trying to sort of, hey, you give me dirt on Biden and I'll give you the weapons that we just approved, that deal. Well, the guy behind all that really is this oligarch Firtash, who had this deal as a middleman, the exclusive rights to buy gas in Russia, because the pipelines of Russian gas, primarily, not so much oil, but natural gas, all flow through Ukraine and the Black Sea. So he is buying gas from Russia, reselling it in Ukraine, and then he's kind of selling it to Western Europe. He's got this middleman, and he made billions of dollars, and a whole bunch of the kickbacks of that kind of arrangement went right back into Putin's pocket. And way before the Trump thing, we had tried to extradite him because he was actually brought up on charges here in the United States for bribery. And there's a whole bunch of real estate bribery stuff. And one of them was got a Trump angle big time, but it won't go into all that. But, and again, you know, I just hate, yeah, I've mentioned Rudy. You know, he's so anxious to hurt Biden and everything that he turns to Firtash and his guys, one of whom was a prosecutor in a very corrupt criminal justice system, which we'll talk about next. And he said, listen, if you, Rudy, talking to him and his guys, say, you dig up some of that Biden dirt, and this extradition that we're trying to extradite you to America for bribery, we'll make that go away. But this is just one of a million schemes about gas and oil, particularly gas. Now it's improved. There have been a lot of reforms there. And actually in 2018, a whole bunch of state revenue, all this money is not going in any profits. None of it is, even though it goes to the Ukraine, none of it ends up in Ukraine's treasury government. Now it is. So the Ukrainians are actually, the government is actually getting revenue out of gas sales, didn't used to. Justice system is a joke. Only 5% of the population trust. It's just so corrupt. And I haven't heard anything about this getting better. And then this thing about monopolies, this is really where oligarchical clans had, since the beginning of the state in the 90s, had carved up different industries and sectors, business sectors amongst themselves that were impervious to anti-corruption or any policing of any kind. So at the moment, I think it says only 42% of all the markets are competitive in Ukraine, and there's still huge corrupt monopolies. And a lot of those are still being enabled by government officials that have not been gotten rid of yet. So that's a big problem. Higher education blew me away. A major corruption area is professors, deans, and department heads bribery demands. How do bribery demands for professors, deans, and departments to get grades, to get accepted into university? They're taking bribes. Huh?
We've got that too.
Do we?
Yeah. Don't you remember?
I've never heard that.
Hollywood people who were
Oh yeah, well, no, I remember that.
Yeah,
The-
that's what
yeah.
I'm talking about.
Those Hollywood stars
Yeah,
that
that's right.
lined somebody's pocket and got their kid in. Yeah, yeah, I do remember
That's all
that.
that's why I go to jail.
Huh?
In this country, they went.
They went to jail, thank you.
Yeah.
But this is a big part of undealt with corruption in the Ukraine. I didn't expect that one. And there's a bunch of deregulations stuff, and this is like government agencies that are starting to be abolished because they're so corrupt. Like there's one called the Traffic Police Inspectorate and the Real Estate Registration Agency. I mean, you can just imagine what the real estate registration, how you might be able to take advantage of that if you wanted to, I guess. And then law enforcement, of course, and like you'd expect in this story, is bribe driven. It operates the way the old communist, law enforcement, a lot of third and fourth world countries, but they're fixing that a lot. Apparently, they've got this new kind of organization called Police Patrol, and they are now putting, they've got a reputation for putting police officers on the street that are trained and they are not subject to bribery. And they're becoming the primary, at least on the street, on the ground police force, which is a big deal. And they're fixing that. So that's one thing they're fixing. But if you're Vladimir Zelensky and you ran on the anti-corruption platform in 2019, you got your hands full. But again, this is. So the Maidan Revolution. Okay, so remember we've got this Putin guy running, was it Yanukovych or Yushchenko? I think Yanukovych. He is the president in 2013. And he's been working with the European Union on what's called the Association Agreement. And that's that preliminary first agreement you strike with the EU to be considered for ultimate membership in the European Union. It doesn't get you in, but it lays out all the things you have to do in terms of, everything. I'll read something a little bit later about that EU. But just before, days before it was supposed to be signed, he scuttles the whole deal because he's getting intense pressure from Putin to not do anything with the European Union, let alone NATO. We're not even talking about NATO at all now. And that triggered this huge revolution in the streets, the Maidan Revolution. And Maidan means square, like the public square. Maidan is a square in the middle of town. Now, and it got bloody. I mean, it went through various phases of escalation, and it finally got troops firing on unarmed students and civilians. And the more they killed them, the more people came out to demonstrate. Now, why did they do that? What was their impetus for this thing? Why did they want to join the EU? To just sort of break their tie with Russia? Yeah, but the number one reason you're going to go out on the street and demonstrate then was to end corruption. This whole corruption thing drove probably the biggest event in modern Ukrainian history, which is this Maidan revolution. They don't have the rule of law in Ukraine. And if you don't have the rule of law, you will have it if you get accepted into the EU, right? The EU is based on the rule of law, and there's a lot of things you have to do to prove that you're supportive of it, you encourage it, you enable it. It doesn't exist in the Ukraine yet. How do you get it? You run over the EU and say, sign me up, because that's going to get me a pathway, at least, out of corruption into some notion of the rule of law in this country. With oligarchs running it, you don't have the rule of law in any sense of the word. So that's why they hit the streets. And this is just a story kind of escalation. Students started it. Students would like to have a future. They're kind of into that. And they know they can't have a future with the whole corrupt oligarch-driven thing that they're, And so they led that protest. And it starts to escalate. They're calling on Yanukovych to resign, which he won't, of course. And just to sort of calm the waters, Putin offers to cut the price of natural gas for the country and buy a bunch, $15 billion of Ukrainian bonds to prop up the economy. This is like sort of, hey, listen, I get it. Here's a few things I'm going to do to, calm you down and, well, I don't have to tell you that didn't work. In January, Yanukovych signs a bunch of laws restricting the right to protest at all, which only drives hundreds of thousands of more people onto the streets, as you'd totally expect would happen. And then the protesters, particularly kids, start getting killed, students. And it started with sort of 22, and then it went from there. I don't have the final numbers up here, but it even spread to the eastern provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, that again, they've been fighting over since then. And now, of course, and then the government and all this time, you know, people, this is the revolution. This is the Maidan, and this is what's going on in the streets in the middle of Kiev. And it's going on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the more that they try to put it down, the bigger and bloodier it gets. But that's what it felt like. And when the police tried to clear the streets, make all those people leave, that's when many more people were killed. It just keeps escalating. So, and the call for Yanukovych to resign gets bigger and bigger. He can't control. Now he's lost control of the streets. Police can't put it down. And I said before, he gets in a plane in the middle of the night, flies back to Russia. And he delivers a speech that says he's really still the rightful president of Ukraine. He's just on vacation for a while. But he's gone. And that's when regular citizens go into that mansion he built and play pool on his pool tables and do all that stuff, right? When he left. And they had to put in some, you know, interim government was put in place just to, but then the next election is this guy Poroshenko was elected with a normal election cycle, 50% of the vote. And he's running basically on a strong relationship with Europe. But he is replaced, he loses to Zelensky in March of 2019. And Zelensky, of course, is running on, like almost the recent guys, corruption is the big issue. And I mentioned before somebody got here that he got 71% of the vote. I mean, people love this guy even back then as a TV comedian guy. But he's running on anti-corruption. And he gets 71% of the vote in 2019. But just before before the Russians invaded the country, not just in the eastern sections, but really rolled the tanks in what we see now, the invasion. Zelensky's approval ratings had fallen all the way from the 70s to the 40s because they're not, the regular people are not seeing enough progress on the corruption front. And he's trying, and they're really impatient. And so had the invasion not occurred and his approval ratings were falling, would they have turned him out, tried somebody else? Okay, let's get somebody else in as president. Maybe that guy can fix that corruption problem. They were already souring on Zelensky. And then the invasion happened and now he's, well, Zelensky, right? So it just makes you wonder, right? This just tells you how desperate they are to get out from under this corruption problem. Nobody, you know, and how embedded it is. Okay, so we're almost done. And I haven't looked at the time, Tom. So what does Putin do about the Maidan revolution, which kicked out his puppet guy out of the presidency? And now we've got this new world. And Putin's response, of course, was to recognize what is illegally called the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. Those separatists up there in that northeastern part of Ukraine, which has always been Russian leaning. Has nothing to do with the Russian language, by the way. It's just that they kind of are, their ancestors are Soviet and Russian and whatever. And so they just declared after this revolution that, hey, the hell with Ukraine, we're going to create our own republics too, which is what they did, the People's Republic of Donetsk. And Putin recognizes it, and he sends troops into that conflict now, which is escalating all the time, supporting these Russian separatists. Same time, of course, we know he invades Crimea and there's no shot fired, but he just troops, tanks, troop carriers enter unmarked. Remember that, the little green men? There's no insignias on the uniforms or on the tanks or they're, you know, but he annexes. He has a phony referendum to make it legitimate sounding and says, you Crimea, the peninsula and the Black Sea, you are now part of the Russian Republic. You're not part of Ukraine anymore. And that's the way it stands. Then, I mean, it's illegal and all the rest, but for all intents and purposes, it is part of Russia now. So this is a thing about, and this comes from this guy, a lot of this thinking comes from this guy, Timothy Snyder, who wrote one of the books I'm going to recommend, who I recommend you listen to and read a lot. I think he's the best authority on what's going on. And it's like, there's a question here, and it's called, his term, it's a really fancy term called reverse asymmetrical warfare. Why? What's Russia doing in, not now with the big army coming in, but when they started with they invaded Crimea and took over, and they started really pouring resources into those eastern oblats are called, you know, in Donetsk and everything. He basically sets up a guerrilla style warfare scenario. It's not bringing in the big Russian army. It's not using his big army. It's basically guerrilla warfare, the kind of warfare that partisans use. And it's something you do when you're weak and your opponent is strong, right? If you're trying to be an insurgent in a bigger country, more powerful country, and you're trying to overthrow it with you know, an insurgency, what do, right? You dress like civilians, you mix with civilians, you hide among them, and you do what he did in these invasions in the beginning. He sent troops in unmarked uniforms. He trains the fighters in the East in asymmetrical warfare, which is guerrilla warfare. And he does what all good guerrilla fighters do, which is you launch your fighting from cities. So you draw the fire of your opponent into those cities. Think about that, right? So you do stuff, blow up stuff in the city, and then the retaliation comes from the government, and the retaliation is coming right into the cities and destroying the cities too, which turns the population against your opponent. And now, you know, it strengthens the insurgency. So why is Putin approaching this war as a guerrilla fighter in the beginning anyway, when he's clearly not the little guy, he's the big guy with the big army and the big everything, and the Ukrainians are small and weak. And what's the tactics? Well, if you go back to the second slide, way back when we started this is you know, Putin logic. Remember, there's no Ukraine? Putin said in September 2021, there is no Ukrainian republic, never has been. It's an artificial thing. It's part of Russia. We're just making it more part of Russia like it's always been. There is no Ukrainian state, never has been. So if there is no Ukraine, your opponent isn't Ukraine, because it doesn't exist. I'm trying to think like Putin right now, so I'm having a lot of trouble getting this out, but if you think about his logic, and if you declare Ukraine as illegitimate and non-existent, your opponent is small and you are big, but the opponent's wrong. Who's the opponent? The opponent is us. Russians the victim here. They're always the victim, by the way. And you're really not fighting the Ukrainians in this war. You're fighting this vast American conspiracy. After all, it was Hillary Clinton who, this is verbatim from Putin, gave the signal to start the Maidan revolution. Hillary Clinton did that, and he's got proof that Hillary phoned somebody and said, go. Revolution, start, go. He still bitches about Hillary Clinton starting the Maidan revolution of 2014. And because all this activity, particularly in Ukraine, is all part of this American conspiracy to weaken Russia, to marginalize Russia. So he has to adopt guerrilla warfare tactics because he's fighting a much bigger enemy, which is us and Europe and democracy and everything else, okay? See, I mean, it's twisted logic, but that's the theory of why his tactics kind of look this way. And they're really just theories. I'm not, I just find they're resonant to me. And there's a similar concept that this, Snyder comes up with. It's called strategic relativism. If you recognize the limits of your own power, how do you become strong? So no matter how Putin looks at the world and his country, he has a very limited power in the world. If you took away the nuclear weapons he's got, what has he got? He's alone, he has no allies, maybe China, maybe not. I don't believe that for a minute that China is an ally with them, total competitors. But if you recognize the limits of your own power, what you do is you weaken your opponent, right? And the way you weaken your opponent, I mean, Europe is strong. And this is that post-empire phenomenon. Europe is made primarily up of a lot of medium-sized small countries. Independently, each country doesn't have a lot of apparent power. I mean, Britain does, and maybe France, but we think of all those other countries, they are not in their own way a competitive international power in their own way. Their power comes from their unity. And therefore, the European Union, if you assemble all these smaller countries in Europe into a united thing, they all benefit from that. Now, again, you got to believe in the whole theory of the European Union here. But Putin is one small country, EU is lots of small countries, but they're united and they're sharing resources and military doctrine and everything else. And so that's what he's trying to, so what do you do when you've got a united Europe? You try to chip away at it. All the networking that makes that union work is fragile. When I mentioned Marie Le Pen last time or so, a lot of people called me and said, who the hell is Marie Le Pen? And Marie Le Pen
France.
And her father, this goes back a long way, started this what's it called, the United Front, I think it's called, something in France. And it's a far-right, populist, right-wing neo-fascist kind of movement in France. And they have her funding. She's run for president 2 or 3 times now. Most recently, just a month or 2, but she did pretty damn good, better than the last time. And she is advocating the breakup of the EU. She gets almost all of her campaign cash from Vladimir Putin's directly. Putin funds her. And she is absolutely for the breakup of the EU in the same way that Brexit in Britain was that kind of movement, which was also hugely supported by her and Putin. Anything that starts to break apart the EU makes Russia bigger, makes them more, they're not so alone and small anymore because Europe isn't, if the strength of Europe comes because of all these countries are united, if they get disunited, now we've got a real competition that Russia maybe can win. That makes sense? That's why when you see Marie Le Pen doing better every time she runs, it's scary. So the EU, like any sort of democratic construct, democracies that they're not static. They either get weaker or they get stronger. They don't just sit there and simmer. It's like, we're done. Democracy, we got it. We won. We beat the Soviet Union. We did, and we're done. History's over. as we're learning right now, democracy, and I'm sorry for the editorializing now, but democracy is either getting stronger or weaker. It never is static. And you can bitch about, or you can say anything you want about the failures of Vladimir Putin. But when it comes to polluting our civil society, he has won. I mean, maybe that's going too far. But starting with the 2016 election and everything that's come after it, can you think of his wildest dreams of success? Couldn't have imagined what happened to this country from 2014, whatever you want to start that clock, till right now. I mean, we're a country that can't discuss the future anymore. We're terrified of it. We can only, we can't discuss anything but maybe the 2024 election, but nobody wants to talk about it. Certainly not together. His campaign against the EU is ongoing, and it's to break up that unity. And it's shaky. He has wins. Thank God his invasion of the Ukraine made it dramatically stronger, which is completely counterproductive to what his strategy has been, which is to break it apart. It's super strong now. Well, vulnerable though, but much stronger than not the. And they need, if the EU is going to stay relevant and healthy, it can't be static either. Like if you believe that democracy that can't just sit there and be proud of itself and everything's okay, you have to fight for it because something or somebody's going to try to take it apart too. Then you need some new blood in the EU. When the EU was created, all those Iron Curtain countries, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, they were post-communist countries that immediately, when cut loose with the fall of the Soviet Union, were cut loose to be free countries like Ukraine. Each one of them is, they on their own, alone, they can kind of survive, maybe, but they certainly can't prosper alone. They're too small. And they have, like Ukraine, they got too much baggage they're carrying around from their old days, communist days or whatever. They can't, they're too small. When they banded together, and the first thing all those countries do was sign up to join the EU. And it totally reinvigorated the EU. It's hard and it's messy, and you end up with Orbáns in Hungary who want to go backwards and are also holding up this Finnish-Swedish NATO thing. But if you want to strengthen the EU exponentially, you bring Ukraine into it when they're ready. They're not ready, they're too corrupt. And the paradox is the Ukrainians want to get out of corruption by joining the EU. And the EU is saying, we'll let you in when you get rid of corruption. Somewhere in the middle, they're going to come to some agreement and Ukraine will get into the EU. But boy, they're going to have to do a lot of cleanup on aisle 3 here. So, but I just hate this idea of Putin is failing now, but he kicked our ass a few years ago and it really hurt us. And I don't know how we're going to get out of it. And you got to give credit for that one. And that's what this political marketing thing is, which is another interesting term. And this is this whole thing you hear about all the time, you think about all the time, this whole assault on the truth. And a good example of that is, if you take this event. Remember this when that Ukrainian war with the eastern provinces started? The Malaysian airline flight 17 was shot out of the sky over Ukraine. And it was clearly hit by a missile or something, right? And there was all kinds of speculation about who did it, who shot down a civilian airliner, killing 200 and, 40 some people. Well, the Dutch did extensive forensics on exactly how that happened. And you can go online and you can see it. They totally recreated exactly how it happened with this particular Russian-made Buk missile and exactly where it exploded relative to the whole thing forensically is laid out. There's not the tiniest bit of dispute about the Russians, one brigade of Russian troops launched that missile that took that plane down. And the minute that started to become known, what did Putin do? What did Russia do? Did they say, well, we didn't do it? They didn't deny that they did it. The whole point of this notion of truth isn't to get you to believe some version of the truth, right? Russia didn't try to convince us that they didn't do it with their own forensic evidence or something. Instead of that, you flood the zone with conspiracy theories. And if you watch Russian TV or even our media, every day some new report came out of somewhere, mainly, of course, Russian misinformation, greatly amplified by the Fox News of the world, that every day on multiple channels, a new theory of how the plane came down. Oh, we have proof that a Ukrainian fighter mistakenly did it, or did it on purpose because they wanted to blame us. Or, I mean, the list of theories about how that plane came down were all crazy sounding conspiracy theories. Not one of them denied it, but if you corrode the ability to believe in anything, the whole point of flooding the zone with conspiracy theories is you end up not believing in anything. You just can't pick one. So you don't trust anything and you don't trust anyone. And that is the primary construct of totalitarianism, particularly in Putin's concept of, it's based on this notion of disintegration. It's much easier to make, this is a quote from him, it's much easier to make slaves out of people who do not trust each other. If people trust each other and there is a civic society that has a foundation of trust, you can argue all you want about policy and elections or whatever, but holding it all up is some notion of civic society. The minute you blow truth away, how do you have civic society? You kind of don't. I think we're this close to not having civic society anymore. I mean, kind of holding on for dear life, but I don't know. And again, it's just this incredibly effective and simple, free, doesn't cost a dime strategy of not pushing a truth, but corroding your ability to believe in anything or trust anyone. Because it's all becomes relative and very conspiratorial, and here we are. So I'm done, I think, with that upbeat note. But you know what? I just think, we've taken our eye off that ball because we're all kind of intoxicated with the Ukrainian heroics. But don't forget this other stuff. Right? So these are the two books that I would, if you, out of all the millions of books you could read on this stuff, particularly about Putin, I cannot get my head out of this one. I'm still reading it and rereading pieces of it. And this one, Bloodlands, which is again by this guy, Timothy Snyder, who has got, I think, most insight into all these subjects, particularly Ukraine, and all the history that we just sort of went through quickly here. So, and there's also, I think out of all the lectures I've listened to him, there's a couple that are really, really worthwhile hearing. I'm gonna send an email just with a few more links like that, just to, right? So, any?
How is Brexit doing? Is it?
It's so not in the news anymore.
Yeah.
Does anybody know how Brexit is doing?
Ireland now. Ireland voted to, Northern Ireland voted to join Ireland.
The last thing I saw, and I don't know anything about it, was something that really puts the whole sort of coexistence of the two Irelands at risk, but I can't explain how and why that is.
They voted in Northern Ireland to join with the party that wanted to join.
Way to get back in the EU is to join
Is that it?
Ireland, to rejoin the rest of Ireland.
Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is one way to get them.
I saw them there.
All the timeline stuff that you have there,
Yeah.
you know, from World War One,
Yeah.
through to this. Is there any way maybe that could be sent out in an email?
Yeah.
I'd really like to read, to have that
Well, no,
timeline stuff, because
I could send you the whole deck if you want. I mean, that's not too much, maybe.
that might be too much.
Or I could send you that page or
Yeah,
whatever
I
you
like
want.
that, yeah, just those timelines, so that I kind
Yeah.
of keep it all in my head. you
Yeah,
know? Yeah.
at some point it all gets,
Are you gonna make it so we can look at the recording?
yes,
Oh, good.
this is being recorded now like all the ones.
So you'll send us the link.
And the folks that are working here are gonna construct kind of a web place, a website or something, where you can just go play them back.
And you'll send us.
Yeah, yeah. That's work to be done.
Thank you.
Okay.
So sorry, Randy, I was tied up in the fun run tonight.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that too.
Yeah.
I love
Because of
this, but it
my,
also
Yeah,
so
sure.
much.
Good.
but I just wanted to say, I've enjoyed this so much, and I saw maybe a little bit of email traffic, you might have a makeup session.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, for this one particular,
That's what I mean. for
yes,
this one.
because
Yeah.
almost all the other ones kind of lead up to this one.
Yes,
And
yes.
And yet I had a lot of people saying, you know, I've just got conflicts. with
I
this
know.
one. And so I said, hey, I'll put out something, we'll find a common date,
Thank you.
whatever, and we'll do this one again.
This was, I so much wanted to attend, but I happen to be president of the senior center. And probably have to be part of the fun run meeting tonight, but thanks for all you're doing.
No,
Really, really appreciate it very
it's
much.
it's kind of a passion.
And then would you like any contribution?
No, I don't. No. The only people that, if you want to make a contribution, and they should have announced this, not my business, but when somebody like me or whoever uses the space here,
Yes.
they have to pay usually something to rent them.
Oh, okay.
Right, and it's not for me to pay, it's for it's a voluntary audience. If you want to put $1 in a jar, I think of it that way, because somebody has to pay for this
Understood.
rent of this.
So we could
Roosevelt
give some
Center.
money to the office here, to the
Yes.
folks that run this place.
That's right.
But you didn't have to pay for this, or did you?
Not a dime.
Okay.
No, that's just,
We'll make a contribution to them. Yeah.
yes, and that's what people should do.
We'll do that. Thank you, guys.